Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Shelly Gandhi and I am one of the initial leads of CODATA Connect Early Career and Alumni Network. We are happy to launch our second webinar series on research skill development today. We are glad that you could make it for our first webinar under this webinar series. Topic for the day is writing research article for publication in academic journal with our presenter Andy Nobis. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. All the audience would be muted during the presentation. Andy will speak for about 40 minutes and then we'll open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please type them in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and this would be selected by our team and would be read out after the presentation. We will record the webinar and upload it for future reference along with the presentation. So without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker for the day. Andy is Program Manager for Authorship, a project run by UK-based NGO AACCESS. His work is focused on helping researchers develop their research writing and communication skills through online resources, courses, mentoring, and peer learning. He has been instrumental in the development of AuthorAid online course in research writing and proposal writing, which have evolved into massive open online courses, MOOCs. Andy has also trained journal editors in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka in digital publishing practices. He's previously worked for publisher Taylor and Francis in journal e-marketing and library marketing. Now, without further delay, I will turn the time over to our presenter. I welcome you, Andy, to present to this august audience.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Shirley, and thank you very much to CODATA for giving me the opportunity to talk today as part of this webinar. So as a very good introduction, so I don't really say much more about myself, except for I work for an NGO called INASP, and our project is called AuthorAid. It's been going for about 10 years now, and we have a community of about 20,000 researchers from lower middle income countries. So this presentation is called Writing a Research Article for Publication in an Academic Journal. And because of the diverse nature of our community of researchers, mostly early career researchers, this presentation is for a general audience of researchers across quite a broad range of disciplines. And of course, when we're talking about academic writing, there are going to be some disciplines that have very specific guidelines and writing styles, but we're going to be talking more generally about tips and resources that you can use for your different disciplines for different journals. It's worth also pointing out that there's a load of information out there on the internet about research writing. You only need to Google how to write a research paper. There's lots of free resources. We're going to recommend some of those as we go through the presentation, and there's going to be a long list at the end of the presentation, which we're going to share with you later. So bear in mind, you don't have to scribble everything down really quickly. We can send you the details of all the hyperlinks that I mentioned today. And because this is such a huge topic, I mean, we've done 3 to 4 5-day research writing workshops. And so squeezing this all into a 40-minute session means it's going to be quite a rapid overview of some of the most important topics. The online courses that we do, which I'll mention in a moment, go into these topics in much more detail. Anyway, I'll briefly mention what AuthorAid is. We've been going for about 10 years. We have a community of over 20,000 researchers in most countries. We do some free online training in research and proposal writing. We have an online mentoring scheme on our website as well. Lots of resources and training materials. And we are also in the business of addressing gender inequities in higher education. And you can find out all about our website and our online courses and resources at www.authoraid.info. And also, one more thing to say about those online courses, there are 2 coming up. Scientific writing starts in July, and then we have research writing, proposal writing starting in September. And these are free online courses which you are very welcome to join. So let's get on to the actual publication, the actual presentation rather. So when you're thinking about writing a research paper, where do you actually start? You may have your topic, it may be an idea you have in your head, or maybe something you're starting to write on already. And you might be thinking, if I write this really well and it's good research and it's rigorous, then I can just publish it in a journal when I'm done with my writing, maybe it be an international journal. But it's not always quite that simple. It really depends on the nature of the research you're doing, on its scope, on its niche in your discipline, its significance, its potential use, its context in the broader literature. You need to think about your audience and the views of your peers. And so when we think about where to start, you might think, well, perhaps I could just start writing, get something on paper, and then we go from there. Or you might think, I really need to brush up on my academic English skills. Or maybe I'll start with a literature review. You've probably already done that. But in this presentation, we think that the best first step when thinking about writing an academic paper is to think about your target journals first. And that's the perspective I'm going to take. So the first part of this presentation is about finding a target journal. Now, the academic publishing ecosystem is very international and it's very difficult to navigate at times. You've got lots of different types of journals, you've got open access journals, and you have to do some research to begin with to find out what's actually out there. And of course, there's a big difference between writing different types of papers. There's a difference between writing, for example, a thesis or a dissertation, and then writing something for an academic journal. When you're writing a research paper, you're not just trying to impress your supervisor, you're writing for the rest of the world. Your audience is much more diverse and full of both experts and non-experts. And research articles are normally short, concise, carefully formatted packages of content. So they're ways of communicating to other experts in a way that's most useful for them, which means a package of information that they can quickly digest and interpret and apply to their own work. It's necessary cite it or replicate your work into other contexts. So you really have to think about your readers and try to step inside their shoes. Now, thinking about your audience, when you're trying to write an academic paper, you've got to think of the gatekeepers first. So your first gatekeeper is the journal editor, who has the power to just reject your paper and say it's not suitable for your journal, for their journal at all. Once your paper goes to peer review, you then have to impress the peer reviewers as the second layer of gatekeepers. Once your paper is then published, you have to think about how this paper reads for scientists and academics, what the likelihood is that that's going to be used and cited. And then finally, of course, the ultimate aim for many is for the public to be able to read your paper, then practitioners and policymakers. Also thinking about what the actual goal is of you writing your research paper. What do you actually want this to achieve? Do you want it to be cited by other researchers and make its way into the broader literature? Do you want to find a novel solution or perspective to a problem? Do you want to influence practice or policy? So a lot of what you do and write and the way that you write and structure your work is actually going to be influenced by the journals that you're publishing in. So identifying target journals in advance and also reading those target journals is important. And this is because journals have different aims, they have different scopes and style guides, they have very different audiences and ethical guidelines and data sharing requirements. And this is sometimes even within disciplines and sub-disciplines. For example, one thing that many early career researchers realize as soon as they come to publish their paper, a lot of their target journals have very different ethical guidelines, and they realize that it's very difficult to go back and do anything about that once the research has already been done and the data collected. So think about your journal well in advance. And then, of course, we've got peer review. So you'll always have to pass through a round of peer review at least before your paper is published. And it's worth mentioning that this is often a very difficult and time-consuming process, but it's essential to refining your work. Sometimes, as I've already mentioned, the editor may decide that your paper isn't going to go through to peer review in the first place. And we hear from lots of early career researchers who are very upset that their paper has been instantly rejected by the editor. And we call this desk rejection. And quite often this means that the author has not read enough about the journal, learnt about its scope and what it's trying to achieve. And so it's always important to read the aims and scope page of a journal and the instructions to authors page. This is a popular cartoon which depicts peer review. I hope this doesn't scare you off too much from the peer review process, but there's always an ongoing joke that it's quite a scary process and you have to go through lots of stages to get your paper accepted. But I assure you it's not quite this frightening. So moving on then to identifying a target journal. And here we have a picture of a huge library just to demonstrate that there are hundreds and thousands of academic journals out there. Some estimates have been made that there could be up to 50 or 60,000 academic journals in the world. So you've got lots of choice and you don't feel you have to submit to the first journal you come across. As I've already said, it's important to decide early before drafting the paper. Don't write the paper and then look for a journal because you're going to have problems then making that paper fit into the journal guidelines. Familiarise yourself with the journals in your field, particularly the big major journals and the minor journals, just so that you're aware of a reasonably broad range of what journals might be good for you. And also look out for journals that have published work similar to yours. Which journals already appear in your reference lists and citations? There are lots of factors to consider when choosing a journal, and these are just some of them. You want to consider the audience of that journal. Who's your research going to reach? Who's going to read it? What's the subject scope and perhaps even the geographical scope of the journal? This is important to know to see if your research is appropriate for that journal. Also, access, free access and open access. Is your target audience actually going to be able to read the journal? Is there a certain level of prestige you're looking for? Things like publication time and likelihood of acceptance are also important, and quite often you can find this information on some of the journal homepages, even sometimes within individual articles. It gives you an idea of how long some papers have gone from submission to acceptance to publication. And quite often journals provide a likelihood of acceptance, an acceptance rate. And also finally, the one thing that often comes up for early career researchers, they're being asked to publish in a journal which is indexed or which has an impact factor. And I thought it was worth just talking through what this actually means. So these are commonly considered as the most important journal indexes for credible scientific and academic journals. And you may have heard of some of these. Now, it's important to stress that it's not absolutely necessary that your target journal is indexed in these, but what these indexes do is they mean the journal content is well disseminated, it's well connected to literature, and it's also often a good indication of the credibility of the journal. Now, first of all, we've got the Web of Science or Journal Citation Reports, which is run by a company called Clarivate Analytics. And this is where the famous impact factor comes from. So in order for a journal to have an impact factor, it has to be indexed within this particular database. And this database has quite a strict inclusion criteria. So many journals out there in the world don't actually have an impact factor. Again, I say it's not absolutely necessary to be indexed here or to have an impact factor, but if that's what you're being asked to consider, then check this website, the master journal list of Clarivate, to check that your journal is actually on there. Another similar database, which is slightly more broader and more diverse, is called Scopus. And you can search their databases on the Scopus sources website or something called SciMajo, which is a useful place for search for journals. There's also a database called PubMed, specifically for medical journals. And then finally, we've got the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ, which is a good index of purely open access journals. It's a really good place to find open access journals for you to publish your research. So those are the main important journal indexes. If a journal says it's indexed in one of these databases, always check these websites to check that that claim is actually true. So there are many journal publishers in the world, from the big academic publishers, which I'm bringing up a few on the screen now. You may have heard of lots of them, Elsevier and your Springers and your Taylor and Francis. So these are almost all based in Europe and the US. You've also got, as I'm showing in yellow, some society publishers. You've got lots of big ones and small ones. You've got some journals which are one-off journals run by very small societies, and some much bigger ones such as the American Chemical Society. Increasingly, there are also these things called mega journals, which are becoming more common, such as Scientific Reports, PLOS ONE, F1000, which I could talk about later. And then in blue, these are some other journal platforms which are not necessarily based in the US or in Europe, such as African Journals Online and Cielo. And these are really good journal platforms for those of you who want to publish your research, which is focused on what's going on in the global south. So there are lots of options all over the world as to where you can publish your research, lots of platforms, lots of publishers. So bear this in mind when you're thinking about journals to publish in. You've got lots of options. And of course, there are lots of different types of journals. And I've tried to break this down into about 5 different categories, although there are always different journals which might overlap these. But this is what I think are the 5 main categories. So you've got your top tier multidisciplinary journals, of which there are a few sort of star players, such as Nature and Science. And as an early career researcher, perhaps this might be a bit out of your reach. This is a very ambitious goal, but maybe at some point you may think about whether you could get published in Nature or Science. And these are journals which cover a very broad range of scientific subjects, and they're looking for really significant, novel international research. And then you've got your top tier single field journals, of which there are a lot more. And these are the top journals in those particular fields or subdisciplines, such as Cell, New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of Political Economy. And again, these are journals that are looking for real significant research, real novel research in those fields. So these journals so far are really difficult to get into. They've got very rigorous selection and peer review methods, and their acceptance rates are very low. Something which is reasonably new are called mega journals. They're open access platforms. They're not so much looking for the novelty and significance, but any credible research, any rigorous research which could be published, can be published on these platforms. They, because they're not stuck into publishing a certain number of issues a year, they can publish thousands of papers on an ongoing basis. And then you've got your international specialized journals. And I think most journal publishing is actually pretty niche and happens in specialized journals. So you're more likely to be publishing in these kinds of journals. So you've got your main top tier Lancet journal, but they also have a specific journal on diabetes and endocrinology. But you've also got very niche journals such as fungal diversity, Journal of Supply Chain Management. The advantage of publishing in these journals is that you're probably going to reach other academics in your field who are more likely to read these than they are to read much more broader top tier journals. And then of course, you've got what we might call regional journals, such as journals focusing on certain geographical regions or countries, such as the Sri Lanka Journal of Psychiatry and the Chinese Journal of Ecology. Quite often these may not have the prestige of big international journals, but they still have a very important role to play. And quite often, particularly for early career researchers, they can be a step on the ladder to them publishing something in an international journal. But they have an important role to play. Finally, some more things to consider about looking for a suitable journal. I've recommended 2 articles here. The first one is from a colleague of mine, actually, Rari Murugasan, who wrote an article called "How to Publish in a Journal That's Right for Your Research." So what he says is 5 things. Stay away from predatory journals, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like. There are journals out there that are looking to take money off of young researchers, but don't provide the quality control and don't provide the peer review that you might expect from more rigorous journals. So that moves on to the second point: look for verifiable claims. Check what the journal is saying is actually true. And key to this is understanding how the open access model works. And again, we may not have time to talk about this, but perhaps if you have any questions, we can talk about it in the Q&A. There are several different models of open access, and it's important to understand how this works and how it's not always about the money that you have to pay as the author. So there's a gold open access model, there's a green open access model, and there's something else quite often called a platinum or diamond model. So try and find out about what these models mean and about how they can help you make your research more open. Fourth point, don't be swayed too much by the impact factor. For some people it is important, but it's always not the best indicator of the quality of a journal or the quality of a piece of individual research. It really reflects the number of citations a journal has had over a particular amount of time. And finally, care about your audience, as we've already mentioned. This other article by Duncan Nicholas is also a really good article, and I recommend reading it for taking you the steps on looking for a journal. And as he says, understand index and databases and metrics. So we've already talked about that. Make sure you read the aims and scope and the instructions to authors again to make sure you're submitting to the right journal. And sometimes you may have to write a cover letter which accompanies your submission. So moving on now past the topic of looking for a journal and on to actually writing. So the writing of a paper, and we're going to talk about the macro, the big picture, and that's the structure of your paper. Writing a research paper is not writing a story. There isn't going to be a surprise ending or a twist, and you aren't building up suspense. So quite often, as you see in these two examples, you will have an abstract where you're already explaining an overview of the research, what's going to happen in this research, what the results are, and the conclusion. So somebody who reads a good abstract summary of your paper will already know what's about to happen. And so throughout the paper, there's a particular structure or different types of structure you can use or need to use for certain journals, which will break this down. Take your author with you and tell them about the why, the how, and the what. So one of the most common structures for writing a research paper is called the IMRAD format. And this is very common, particularly common for biomedical healthcare sciences or the hard sciences. And what IMRAD means, it stands for, firstly, introduction. Why did you do that? Methods, how did you do that? Results, what did you find? And discussion, what does it mean, or so what? And there's quite a few articles out there which talk about more about this and how it's used. So quite often this is compared to an hourglass. So basically you are talking broadly about your topic, and then you're narrowing down to your own research, narrowing down to your results, and then you're broadening again to discuss others' research and how your research fits in and the wider implications. So that's the IMRAD structure. Of course, sometimes there may be variations on this. You may have a literature review section, you may have an analysis, background, a summary, implications, mathematical models or theoretical models. So it's not always exactly like this, but this is one of the most common structures or frameworks. Quite often in the social sciences and humanities, for example, you may have a completely different structure where you have thematic headings, which take a completely different structure, but they're still logical. What I've shared here is a couple of tips from an article called 10 Simple Rules for Structuring Papers. And I'm going to take 5 of these rules. This is an article from PLOS ONE, which I really recommend reading. And it talks more generically about how to structure your paper. And I find some of these rules really useful. Number one, focus your paper on a central contribution which you communicate in the title. It's always good to have a very clear title which communicates your central contribution, your central argument, and isn't too long, isn't too technical. You need to be able to work out what this paper is about through the title. Rule number two, write for flesh and blood human beings who do not know your work. And we'll be talking about this in a moment in terms of writing in plain English where necessary and writing for non-experts. Stick to the content conclusion scheme. This is another way of structuring your paper in a very simple way. First of all, we talk about context, then you talk about the content, your research, and you come to your conclusion. Also a useful way of making sure that you stay on track. And then related to this, optimizing the logical flow, particularly by avoiding zigzagging. And I think this is a temptation for all of us and a temptation for anybody with an academic mindset. You always want to start talking about related things and how they relate to your core argument. Try to avoid doing this. Don't zigzag into separate topics and confuse your reader. And finally, as we've already mentioned, tell a complete story in the abstract. And there are 5 other really good tips in this paper. What I wanted to focus on in particular is, for a moment, is the introduction section. This is a section which can be a really important part of your paper. It comes up very early, and it's one of the most difficult parts of the paper to write quite often. We talk to lots of early career researchers who struggle with this because they've already done their research, they've already got their results, and now they want to situate this in the context of other research. And they find it particularly difficult. And quite often we find that many inexperienced researchers end up with lots of plagiarism in this section because they haven't thought about this from the beginning. So this is a section where you show your understanding and that you understand the field and the broader work in this discipline and how your work fits in and why you're going to do this, you're going to approach this in a particular way. But some more specific tips on this was written by a blog post on a website by somebody called Adele Tufford. So this picture represents somebody getting slightly confused and bored by your introduction. So what she says on our blog post, and not the person in the picture, but the person, I'll give the full name of the blog post in a moment. What she says is justify your research and why you're doing it. So the fact that it simply hasn't been done before is not reason enough. We need to understand what the value of this is. And also the fact that there's not enough data available on this topic is also not justification. You need to explain why this research is important. Also important is to not just provide a list or background of what people have done in the past, but discuss why this is interesting. And readers can understand why you've built on all this previous research and why you've done this to situate it in the context of other work. And finally, something which I see in a lot of work in introduction sometimes, don't exaggerate. Don't talk about the best, the most, or the first time this research has been done, because it probably isn't the first time, it's probably not the best. So perhaps be humble. So that's another interesting set of tips on the Author Aid website. Moving on now to the micro, the writing itself. So we're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty here of writing. And now, again, this is a huge area. We could talk about this for hours, and academic English is a particularly difficult topic. I have to apologise as an Englishman that we've invented such a difficult language to master and write in an academic way. But there are 2 common errors that I think we spot quite often. I thought it's worth focusing on these 2 and seeing what we can do about them. One of them is writing too much and then having to cut down your work to fit into the word limits of a particular journal, which is something that I often struggle with writing too much. And then writing too formally and using too much sophisticated language and jargon, sometimes acronyms as well. So what can we actually do about these 2 problems? Well, this is a resource that I like, written by somebody called Nilam McGrath, She works with Author Aid, and she wrote this 7 rules for using plain English. And you can go and check out this resource yourself afterwards, but I thought I would focus on 2 in particular. And they are preferring active sentences and using you and we. So it's really useful if you're talking in plain English. And I think plain English is underrated when it comes to academic writing. Sure, there are some journals which require very technical language and writing in a particular way. But even then, I think the rules and the philosophy underpinning writing in plain English are important to remember. So, and also, one bonus is writing in active sentences can cut down the number of words you use. So, for example, here, using active sentences in saying Anne watched television, rather in the passive version, the television was watched by Anne, already cuts down the number of words by half, as well as making the text more readable. And likewise, saying you and we also cuts down the number of words that you use, as well as making the paper much more easy to read and give it a natural flow. And I'll demonstrate this with some examples now. So instead of the workshop was facilitated by Andy, simply Andy facilitated the workshop, or the research team carried out the experiment. Here's another quite convoluted phrase. It was decided by the governor that the assistance to the project was to be suspended. How can we write this more simply? Perhaps the governor suspended the project, also cutting out some jargon and unnecessary words. And then this is where we and you comes in handy. It is believed by the authors that the time must be placed on the exercise by the coordinators. We believe that coordinators must place a time limit on the exercise. So again, you're cutting down the words, you're making it easier to read. I think I was struggling with reading the first sentences myself then. So these are some things that you can put into practice. Using active sentences rather than passive sentences can be really useful in many circumstances. I mean, there's lots more we could say about tips for improving your academic English, for example, using connecting words, improving your vocabulary of connecting and transition words so you can have more of a flow in your sentences and connect sentences and paragraphs together with the right kind of language. Another thing that I am always saying is people tend to use very strong adverbs and strong language rather than using more moderate and tentative language, which looks more humble, looks more professional and credible, which goes back to what we were saying earlier about not exaggerating too much. All 3 of these resources are part of a website called Unilearning, which is an academic writing guide, which I'd recommend checking out if you want to follow up on any of these particular resources and vocabulary. Speaking of vocabulary, there's another great resource that I would recommend to anybody who's struggling with the kind of language to use and the phrases to use in academic writing. And this is the Academic Phrase Bank from the University of Manchester. And what this gives you is lots of example sentences, example phrases that you can adapt and put into your work to link things together properly, to basically make yourself sound more of an academic who knows what they're talking about. There are lots of tips that we can give. There are lots of generic tips out there for writing advice, but quite often it's actually more useful to learn things which are more suited to your particular subdiscipline or discipline. And I think one of the best tips that I've heard to learn how to write is actually to do more reading. This guy writes a really good blog. His name is Raul Pacheco Vega. He's got a really good blog which talks about both reading and writing. And he says that reading is an integral part of writing. And if we don't read and make time to read, we'll probably not be able to situate our scholarship within the global scholarly literature. I think particularly if you want to learn how to publish, write to publish in particular journals, you really need to spend some time reading the papers of those journals. Much more useful than generic advice that we can give you on how to write. Learn how to write in particular journals. Finally, I mean, there are many ethical topics that we could talk about when we are discussing academic writing. There's authorship, there's data fabrication, there's all sorts of topics that we could delve into and spend lots of time talking about. But I think plagiarism is probably the #1 topic that always comes up with young researchers that are looking to write academic papers, particularly in journals. And so I wanted to touch on this topic briefly. This is a standard definition of plagiarism, the use of others' published and unpublished ideas or words without attribution or permission and presenting them as new and original rather than derived from an existing source. Always good to have a definition there to work to. I wanted to show you briefly a screenshot from Turnitin, which I think is quite interesting to see sometimes. What you've got here is a plagiarism checker, which has picked out chunks of plagiarized text in a submission. And so this is a useful tool for supervisors and journal editors to check that their submissions are not plagiarized. And they're very powerful at spotting chunks of text which have been copied, even if some of the words have been changed. But I also wanted to share some common myths about plagiarism, and I think these are the most common myths. And one myth is that there is a percentage of acceptable and unacceptable plagiarism. So there's one of the myths is that this number that you'll see in the top right-hand corner is the amount of plagiarism, whereas actually what it is called a similarity index. This is the amount of text which is similar to a different source. What this number does for a supervisor or a journal editor is alert them that there's a similarity which might be too high. So if it goes over 20 or 30%, then that editor might want to think about reading the paper themselves. So this is about flagging something to an expert who can then go into the program and check to see if that's actual plagiarism or not. So don't get too transfixed on this percentage yourself, because it may not actually represent the amount of plagiarism. Another myth, I think, is that we should use plagiarism detecting software as an author, as an early career researcher, as a way of avoiding plagiarism. I don't think, personally, this is the best way of avoiding plagiarism. For a start, plagiarism checkers are quite expensive. They also provide you with percentages like this, which aren't necessarily helpful, but also free versions of this software are very, very rarely useful. There are lots of free versions out there, and they should be treated with a lot of caution because of some of the things you have to sign up to. They don't always have access to the best databases to cross-check your work. I would say it's much more useful to focus instead on building your correct citation and referencing skills. And we'll talk about this in a moment. And I think another common myth, lots of early career researchers come to us and say they're really scared of plagiarism, accidentally plagiarizing, getting into trouble, getting blacklisted, getting banned from journals. But I think you need to realize that there are many different levels of plagiarism. Particularly honest mistakes can be picked up in the peer review stage. They can be corrected before the draft is published. A good journal editor will know there's a big difference between misattributing something or some minor copying and blatantly stealing somebody's ideas or using large chunks of text from Wikipedia. So honest mistakes can be corrected as long as you spot them in the drafting process. There's this blog post on our website by Matt Hodgkinson is a really good guide to how to avoid plagiarism, how to avoid plagiarizing work. And there's some quite obvious things there which many of you may already recognize, already know about. You need to make sure you cite every source from which you took an idea, fact, text or figure. But also you need to make sure that you've actually read those sources before you cite them, not just cite it because you've seen the abstract or you've seen it cited in another article. So make sure you've actually read it. If you use exact wording, make sure you actually put quotation marks around the text. So when you're making notes, make sure you put quotation marks in the notes that you're taking. So when you actually go to put that in your article, it shows as an entire quotation and it's not your own work. And one of the most important things in this blog post, which I think is worth pointing out, don't reword the text unless you're paraphrasing. So in other words, either use your own words or quote the exact wording So either paraphrase using your own words or quote the text in its entirety. There's another tip in here about sometimes the methods section, you can use very similar wording to other research papers, but make sure that you're actually attributing them. But we're going to look at some examples here. This is an exercise we do quite often in workshops called paraphrase or plagiarism. And this is an original piece of text. And what we're going to do is show you three different examples of somebody who's trying to reference this work. This is the first example. And as you can see in this example, the white text is the original text, and the author has just changed a few words, deleted a couple of words, added a few more in. And this is a very bad paraphrase, and this is plagiarism, and they haven't cited the author at all. The second example, and don't worry, we'll share these slides with you so you can go through these in more detail. In the second example, we do have a citation at the end of the quote, but the text is still mostly the same. Is that they've removed some more words, they've added some more words, but it's still a mishmash of the original quote. And any plagiarism detector should pick that up. This is bad paraphrasing, it's borderline plagiarism. This is how it should be done. This is a well paraphrased piece of work, it's well referenced. You've got the citation in there. The blue text is the words of the author. It's entirely the words of the author, apart from the yellow bits where they've had to use the exact phrases of the author because they couldn't use their own words for that, and so they put those in quotation marks. So that's how you do it, that's how you paraphrase. I'm running low on time, so I'll quickly mention a couple of things about writing productivity, because obviously all this is very difficult. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes incentives. And there are many different techniques you can use. Some people like writing sprints. Some people like the Pomodoro technique, using 20-minute blocks to focus on very efficient writing. Obviously, collaborative writing with other people, can be better than writing on your own. Some people like to set aside a specific amount of time, switch off their TV, switch off the phone, switch off the internet, which I know is very difficult, and write. Karen Russell says, enjoy writing badly. Judy McCall says you can't edit a blank page. So what they're saying is just write. You can edit it later, just get words on the page, and then you can go from there. For perfectionists such as myself, I don't like that approach because I don't like editing later. And there's another video which we'd recommend watching. Finally, I wanted to mention a counterintuitive way of looking at this, which says that all these writing tips you may have read about on the internet aren't necessarily going to work for you. Some tips may work for your colleagues or your supervisor, but they may not suit your style. Lots of writing time doesn't necessarily mean lots of writing. Sometimes more reflection rather than writing can actually help. And also your practices may change over time. You may become a more efficient writer. So another interesting article to read on different ways of looking at writing productivity. Not all of these ways will work for you. You've got to find the method that works best for your style. And I think that's come to the end of my main presentation. So does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Andy, for your presentation, and it was very insightful. We have lots of questions which have been poured in. And now I would like to invite Felix to take up the question and answers. Felix, are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for the insightful presentation. So now we will take a few questions from the participants. So this one is from Jad Porcher. And the question reads, is there a list on predatory journals?
Okay, that's a very good question. So there are some lists. There are what we call blacklists. There used to be something that was quite well known a few years ago, and it's called Beale's list. And you may hear about that from your friends and colleagues. And it was a list of so-called predatory journals that was done a few years ago. It's slightly out of date now, and I wouldn't entirely recommend that you consult Beale's list because it's not up to date. It's not very transparent in the way that things have been put on the list. There's also another blacklist from a company called Cabell's, C-A-B-E-L-L. They run a blacklist of predatory journals, but it's a paid service, so you may not be able to access it, so this may not be of any use to you. But there are a few of these so-called blacklists out there. Personally, I prefer what we would call the whitelist approach, in that you use existing journal indexes to check if the journal that you're looking at is actually on those credible lists, such as the Directory of Open Access Journals. If you're in any doubt about a journal, check DOAJ to see if the journal is on there. If it's on DOAJ, then it shouldn't be a predatory journal. You can probably trust the credibility and the quality of that journal.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And the next question is from Kaka Lee. And the question I read, could you suggest to me some ways that will help more in choosing a topic while writing a research paper? I'll read it again. Could you suggest to me some ways that could help me more in choosing a topic while writing a research paper?
Well, yes, I mean, that's quite a fundamental question, I think. And I think this boils down to the research that you do before you start. And I think the most important thing is to do as much reading as possible. Personally, in the last couple of projects that I've done, they've been based on some things that were already in my head. And I started doing a search in Google Scholar and some other databases to work out what's out there already, what research has been done already in this broadly in the area that I was thinking about. And I think it's important to identify gaps in the existing knowledge and literature first, and that's a good way of identifying good research topics. So you're not doing something that's already been done. And one tip that a journal editor actually gave me recently was it was actually a writer. She said, search for the phrase "more research is needed in this area," and you're likely to find some gaps in the existing literature, which would be a really good place to start. That's the way that I would approach it.
Okay, so the next one is from Vinit Kumar. Could you throw more light on how to handle the peer review process, especially the rejections?
Yes, in fact, one of the links that we gave, we've got a long list of resources at the end of the presentation, which we'll share later. And one of them is Dealing with Peer Review by somebody called Dr. Carol Sargent. And it goes through some tips, particularly with regards to dealing with rejection. And I think dealing with rejection is something that all researchers have to do, even highly cited, highly published superstars in the world of research have been rejected from time to time, and then you'll always hear stories about them saying, well, that particular rejection was actually a crucial learning moment for me. And I think in terms of when you get comments back from peer reviewers, don't be disheartened. But try to focus on the thing, as long as it's not an outright rejection. If they're trying to suggest that you can do things to improve your paper, take those seriously, even if you feel a bit insulted. Try to focus on the things that you can do, and also you can still communicate with the editor. Talk to the editor about any of the concerns that you have with the feedback, and also. Consider going back to the editor with a plan about what you're going to do, what your plan of action is in terms of dealing with the peer review comments. But there's a really good couple of resources that we mention as links in this presentation. One of them is what we said, the blog post on the website. There's another one called Peer Review, the nuts and bolts, and it's quite a long resource on all the ins and outs of how peer review works. But don't be too disheartened by negative peer review, because everybody has experienced it.
Okay, so this next one is from Abdurrahman, and his question is about who has the rights to appear as co-author, and he's focusing in particular on statisticians' rights to be co-author.
I think that's an excellent question, and I can probably only partially answer it without having any experience myself of being in a writing project with a statistician. I think the first thing I would always do if there was a query about authorship rights is to refer to a very specific document, and that is I'll just check the acronym. I think it's the ICMJE Authorship Guidelines. That is the International Council for Medical Journal Editors, and they have quite a landmark guideline document which sets out who qualifies to be a listed author on a research paper. And the very quick answer to that is anybody who has made a significant contribution to the paper, and that needs to be applied to certain circumstances, particularly in terms of how significant the contribution was in terms of the role of the statistician. But I'd recommend that resource myself.
Okay, so this is from Mark Parsons. We and you is good. What about I for single author papers?
That's also a very good question, and I think you've caught me out there. I think the answer is also yes. I would say that's still acceptable personally.
Okay, Andy, all right, I can go to the next question.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So this is from Felady. I would like to publish from my thesis. The question is, how do I avoid self-plagiarism?
That's an excellent point, and something that we didn't mention in the presentation. Self-plagiarism it's a tricky area, because as a writer, you think if you're just using your existing ideas, how can that be plagiarism? They're my ideas. I think, but when it comes down to it, it's actually very simple. If you're using ideas that you have published or elsewhere in any format, you have to cite that particular output, that particular paper or journal presentation or presentation. You just have to make reference to a previous work that you have done. I think the ethical implication here is that somebody reading your paper, they think that what you're saying in the paper is new original ideas. And if you're using your old ideas that you've published elsewhere, then you're kind of you're misrepresenting that work as not the most up-to-date work. So basically, I think it's just as simple as properly referencing your previous work in what you're currently doing.
Thank you, Andy. And this next one is from Pedro. Can we talk about auto-plagiarism when it comes to a series of articles on the same topic that you have been working on? I should take that again?
Okay, yeah, please.
All right. It's from Pedro.
Yeah.
Can we talk about auto-plagiarism when it comes to a series of articles on the same topic that you have been working on?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but is this so?
Okay.
If
Yeah,
you're,
yeah. The question is a term called auto-plagiarism, and which could affect an author when they are working on a paper that is of the same topic, but probably published in different journals.
I think the solution is always just in being very clear when you're writing where those ideas came from. Even if you're working on lots of different similar papers with different authors, you just have to be very transparent about where those different ideas came from. And sometimes that can just be very messy, and you've got lots of citations embedded within citations. But I think that I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but just make sure you fully cite everything that you are referring to, every idea, every other paper, every other related paper that you have done, you and another colleague have done, or has been done elsewhere.
All right.
I hope that's useful in some way.
Yeah. So this is from Caroline. Thank you, Andy. Some journals may be of high class, some low class, and some middle class. How do I know where my paper belongs?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, you could say that you've got low, medium, and high class journals, but quite often it's more, I think it's more complicated than that. And quite often your research isn't just poor, medium, and good, and doesn't neatly fit alongside journals of the same, of those kind of categories, but it's more about different journals focusing on different things, focusing on different subdisciplines, focusing on different geographical areas. So sometimes you might be looking to publish a paper which is really excellent research, say for example on something that's happening within your country, and you may be thinking that, oh, this is brilliant research, this should go in the top journals. And there might be a conflict that you come across whereby you try to publish it in so-called international journals, but they reject your paper because it's not of what they call international significance, or it doesn't have a global view. And then there may be circumstances where it might be more appropriate to publish in a national journal because it's very specifically national research, which may not be of interest to a broader international audience, but maybe better in that national journal, or maybe more accessible to the actual audience you're looking to get to in a particular niche or geographically confined journal. So I think it depends on what standards you can reach and on your actual audience, your readership.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And this question is probably the last one we can take for today because of our time. This is from Basha. I find it difficult paraphrasing materials and methods section of a manuscript. Any hints, please?
So difficulty in writing the method section.
Yeah, paraphrasing the materials and methods section, yeah.
Yes, I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer because it can be very specific to individual fields. And so I think it's quite difficult to provide advice on this, except that you should look to read as many journals in your particular subdiscipline as possible. So very niche journals which focus on your particular area of research. Read those journals, read the methods that they use in those journals, make notes on them, highlight the kind of language they use, highlight the techniques they use. I think that's probably the only useful tip I can give without being an expert myself in that particular field. But it is a very difficult part of the paper to write. It's quite different from the other sections of the paper.
All right. Thank you, Andy. And thank you, everyone, for your questions, and also Andy for the insightful contribution. Thank you. And for the rest of you that asked the question, not to worry. We will respond to all your questions, but not on this platform right now, but in another of our electronic platform, you would get the replies to your questions. So I would hand right back to Shelley. Shelley, you're welcome.
Thank you, Felix. And finally, we've come to the end of this webinar, and we had so many questions. So we'll answer all the questions towards the end. We'll get back to you. So don't worry. And this was our first webinar under Research Skill Development webinar series. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you being here, and we've had brilliant questions from you guys. So it was amazing to have such an amazing audience. On behalf of CODATA Connect and Early Career and Alumni Network, I would like to invite you all to take part in our ongoing essay writing competition and datathon. The last date for submission for both the competitions is 30th June. So we'll put in the details of these competition in the chat box. Thank you again. And if you have any questions, please write to us on codataconnect@codata.org. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today and giving such an insightful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. So please find the links in the chat box, and we'll see you soon next time with more interesting topics in Research Skill Development webinar series. Thank you, everyone.